welcome you back to the second part of Module Two's lecture. Right now we're going to focus on guerrilla warfare. Now, guerrilla warfare is certainly not a new concept. Certainly it wasn't new in the Civil War. There's a great book out that I recommend that you read if you're interested in this subject. It's by a man by the name of Max Boot. The book is entitled Invisible Armies, An Epic History of Guerrilla Warfare from Ancient Times to the Present. And this book covers the span of guerrilla warfare that really starts with Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC. But really, guerrilla warfare has been around a lot longer than that. When you read the Bible, you'll see David's mighty men employing what we would call today irregular warfare against their opponents. For an exhaustive treatment on the subject of guerrilla warfare during the Civil War, I'd recommend that you read Daniel Sutherland's book, A Savage Conflict, The Decisive Role of Guerrillas in the Civil War. So Civil War guerrillas came in a variety of persuasions and so forth. In general, guerrilla fighters are those who wage war on professional soldiers from a place of disadvantage. That would be sort of a roundabout definition for what guerrilla warfare is. It's those who wage war on a professional army from a disadvantaged position, which means then that guerrilla fighters probably would not have the equipment, the weaponry, the sophistication, the organization, and even the leadership that a professional army did, yet they still waged war. A couple examples of guerrilla warfare to point out. First, on the with the Native American Mohawk warrior there, circa 1754. This is what they would have looked like during the French and Indian War in the 1750s. Men like this Mohawk warrior regularly engaged professional British soldiers, redcoats, by ambushing them and using what to an 18th century professional British soldier would have been very unorthodox fighting methods. If you think about the way the British fought during the Revolutionary War, it was they were very regimented. They would stand in a line. They had a procedure for loading their muskets. They had a procedure for firing those muskets and so forth. And they really didn't know any other way to fight. And so when Native Americans would come out of the woods at them and ambush them with their tomahawks and spears, encircling them, and hiding from a place of cover, this was something that really unnerved the professional British soldier. And this is exactly what guerrilla warfare is aimed to do. During the Vietnam War, the Viet Cong did the same thing, as you see depicted with this photograph of this Viet Cong soldier. The Viet Cong would dress up as Vietnamese civilians, making it very difficult for U.S. troops to differentiate between who was an enemy and who was a friendly. They would ambush American troops. They would set traps for them and so forth. And again, they did this from a disadvantaged position. They didn't have the money, the resources that the United States did during that time. And guerrilla warfare is still going on today. U.S. troops in Afghanistan and Iraq are facing that on a daily basis. Now, the Civil War spawned a litany of guerrilla fighters, most notably from the Confederacy. And these men were called bushwhackers. And they were called that because they would their favorite tactic was to ambush their opponent from a place of hiding, usually behind a grove of trees or a bush. And most Union soldiers would lump these Confederate bushwhackers into just like deserters, outlaws, ruffians. They called them all bushwhackers, whether they were or not. And these men, these bushwhackers, they were loyal to the South. They despised the Union, and they used a variety of unconventional methods to kill or to hinder Union troops. Rather than wearing a traditional Confederate uniform, as you can see on the picture, they would wear brightly colored shirts a lot of times. They would carry 2 to 3, sometimes up to 6 pistols, the kind that you see here. And in 1862, Congress, the Confederate Congress, actually approved what was called the Partisan Ranger Act, which legitimized the guerrilla war, basically allowing Southern soldiers to enlist as rangers or partisans instead of in the regular Confederate Army. There was a lot more freedom for these men that chose this path. They weren't required to report into a commanding officer. They didn't have to dress a certain way. They could basically come and go as they pleased. And so a lot of Confederate Southerners chose this route. So the terms scouts and rangers, partisans are commonly used to define and describe Confederate guerrillas. The South seemed to embrace the idea of Confederate guerrillas more than the North embraced their guerrillas, and there were guerrilla fighters on both sides. And that's really not hard to understand when you think about the South. The South generally produced more flamboyant, more colorful soldiers than the North did. And plus the South romanticized warfare more than the North did. Now on the Union side, here's a picture of a typical revolver that both sides would have used, the famous Colt Navy. I actually had one of these years ago. I sold it about a year ago. A lot of fun to shoot this weapon. But it's a black powder revolver, fires a 36 caliber round lead ball. And again, this was the favored pistol for the average guerrilla fighter. Now on the Union side, there were what were called redlegs, or marauders, or buffaloes, or jayhawkers. And it's been estimated that there were 26,550 guerrillas who fought on both sides of the war. However, the number is not as important as the impact that they had on military operations, the impact that they had on public morale, as well as government policy. The guerrilla war also birthed another phenomenon which carried over after the war, giving us our famous Wild West outlaw tales. A lot of Southerners, many who served in the Confederacy or served as Confederate guerrilla fighters, took to a life of crime during and following the Civil War. The notorious James Younger Gang, so named for their ringleader, Jesse James, wrought terror in the post-war South as they robbed northern banks and killed Union sympathizers. Now Jesse James was from Missouri, and he and his older brother Frank fought as guerrillas during the war with a group of men called Quantrill's Raiders, and we'll look at that in just a second. In 1882, Jesse James was killed at the age of 34 by a member of his own gang named Robert Ford while he was in his home. His older brother Frank died at age 72, having been acquitted of all crimes for which he had been charged. Now, speaking of Quantrill's Raiders, William Clark Quantrill was an Ohio school teacher who joined the war as a Confederate guerrilla after the Partisan Ranger Act was passed. He quickly formed a gang called Quantrill's Raiders, and their main pursuit was the apprehension of escaped slaves, although they regularly ambushed Union troops and killed them. Now, Quantrill's Raiders included the following: William Halter, George Todd, Joseph Gilchrist, Perry Hoy, John Little, James Little, Joseph Bond, William Gregg, James Hendricks, and John Coger. Later, in 1862, John Jarrett, John Brown, Cole Younger, as well as William T. Bloody Bill Anderson and Jesse James and his brother would join Quantrill's band. In one of the bloodiest guerrilla raids of the war, Quantrill and a group of 450 hardened guerrillas rode into the town of Lawrence, Kansas on the night of August the 21st, 1863, and burned down most of the town and killed over 185 men and boys. And the motivation for this raid was to capture a jayhawker named James Lane. But earlier that year, Union General Thomas Ewing issued General Order No. 1, which authorized the immediate arrest and banishment of any Southern civilian who was found aiding or abetting bushwhackers. In July, Union troops arrested and imprisoned 9 Missouri women suspected of helping Confederate bushwhackers. And among those women were Bill Anderson's 3 sisters. And these 3 ladies were locked up on the 2nd floor of a jail in Lawrence, Kansas, which collapsed. That jail collapsed on the night of August the 13th, crushing Anderson's 14-year-old sister. And blind with rage, Anderson was all too happy to accompany Quantrill on his raid into Kansas. Another notorious Confederate guerrilla fighter was a man by the name of John Singleton Mosby. Known as the Gray Ghost, Mosby had operated behind enemy lines as a scout for Jeb Stuart's cavalry. Mosby was so successful at this that he earned a ranger commission in 1863 and became head of a group called Mosby's Rangers. As Mosby's notoriety brought federal retaliatory raids, frightened citizens petitioned him to stop his brand of warfare. And to their dismay, Mosby would not relent. He said, quote, "I unhesitatingly refuse to comply," he told them. "My attacks on scouts, patrols, and picket lines which have provoked this threat are sanctioned both by the customs of war and the practice of the enemy." Unquote. And so for all the bluster and excitement, Confederate guerrilla methods were not that effective in the end. At most, they diverted some Union troops from their normal duties, but the Confederacy never put their whole heart into the guerrilla war because such action ran against the aristocratic Southern genteel sensibilities of what was considered gentlemanly conduct. It wasn't gentlemanly to ambush your prey from behind a bush and so forth. And so in the end, the Union resorted to a total war policy designed to crush the rebellion on the Southern home front, which ultimately led to Confederate defeat. Jayhawkers. The term Jayhawker is today, of course, associated with the state of Kansas. And during the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, we see the formation of anti-slavery guerrillas called Jayhawkers. Led by strident abolitionists, including Charles Jennison and James Montgomery, free state men formed vigilante units to protect themselves against the attacks of pro-slavery forces during the time of Bleeding Kansas, which we talked a little bit about in the first lesson. So that's going to conclude module number 2. Don't forget that you can view all the PowerPoint slides on Canvas, and you can view them without having the inset of myself talking to you. So some of the text that's been cut off because of that, you'll be able to review that and see that. So we will start the next module next week, module 3.